G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and today we're bringing you more guests from our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series. In this episode, we'll talk to author and historian Thomas Frank about his new book, People Without Power, The War on Populism and the Fight for Democracy, in conversation with Wayne Swan, ALP National President, the former Deputy Prime Minister and Treasurer, and the Executive Director of the Australia Institute, Ben Oakwest.
As you probably could have guessed by this moment, I have decided in 2020 to run for president.
There has been a rise in anti-white racism and a rise in attacks on the very ideals of Western civilization. It is indeed okay to be white.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not.
My mother got to see Mr. Yoho's disrespect on the floor of this house towards me on television. And I am here because I have to show my parents that I am their daughter.
How good is Australia?
Some of the stories we've seen are unacceptable, and I wouldn't want my mum in some of those places.
And so I am standing before you today to tell you, the British people, that those critics are wrong. The doubters, the doomsters, the gloomsters, they are going to get it wrong again.
Relax. We're doing great.
And I really can't do better to introduce today's topic than to quote from the back of Thomas Frank's new book, in which he says, "Populism today is seen as a frightening thing, a term pundits use to describe the racist philosophy of Donald Trump and European extremists, but this is a mistake." And you can listen now as Thomas Frank explains why everything we think we know about populism is wrong. This was recorded live on Thursday, the 30th of July, 2020, and things may have changed since recording. Welcome, Ben, Wayne, and Thomas. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ebony.
Good to be here.
Thomas, we might start off with you. You've got this new book. Congratulations on the book. I am only a couple of chapters in at the moment, and I will say again, you can buy it from all good bookstores here. But it's obviously an incredible moment to be talking about populism. Why did you decide to write the book?
That's a really good question. By the way, I got to ask you: does the Australian edition have the illustrations in the middle? They should pop right out at you. Well, even if it doesn't. So I'm Kansas. I'm actually speaking to you from Kansas. And about 20 miles from where I'm sitting right now, the word populist was invented. It happened one day in the year 1891. It was this is a man-made word. We know, it was a coinage that was deliberately invented on a train ride between Kansas City and Topeka. And it's always had an important part in my understanding of the world and the way I think about things. And it's, not just for regional pride. It's one of the very, very few things that Kansas can be, that Kansas can be proud of having invented, of having originated, was this word, populism. But it's also because it describes something that at the time was unquestionably noble, positive, democratic. It was a mass movement of farmers who were a really beaten down class in America at the time in the 1890s, and they came together to challenge the sort of political elites in various states. The first state where they went into politics and started a third party, which came to be known as the Populist Party, was right here in Kansas, and they managed to defeat the local Republicans and went from triumph to triumph. Now they had a whole, they made their demands very well known, the populists. They had a manifesto, it was very famous in its day. And if you were to go back, and you can find it online, it's very easy to look up. And if you look at it, it looks like extremely sensible demands. This is it's the equivalent of the British Labour Party and the Australian Labour Party, the German Social Democratic Party. They were all coming up at the same time, these left-wing parties that tried to represent workers. And the demands that the populists made are extremely familiar because we've realized almost all of them. They wanted, They wanted the secret ballot. They wanted votes for women. They wanted government regulation of railroads. They wanted, to get us off the gold standard. That was a big one at the time. They wanted the government to regulate banks, right on down the list. Sort of all the things that we have, and if they wanted a really robust farm program too, of course, all the things that at the time were utterly unthinkable to the economic establishment. At that time, what the American government owed to its citizens who were suffering through hard times was absolutely nothing. The American government did nothing for those people. The government existed to make sure that the market, functioned in a certain way and that corporations did all right. And populists were the first to challenge this. And populism was eventually met. It went, it had its various successes and was eventually met with a kind of upper class hysteria in this country and was beaten down in the year 1896. And that hysteria involved, and this is where the story becomes really peculiar, that hysteria involves all the different sort of ideas and phrases that we attach to populism nowadays, even though the meaning of the word populist has completely shifted by 180 degrees. Instead of being an anti-racist party, now we use the word to describe bigots, etc. Well, I just read Donald Trump nominated a woman to the Federal Reserve Board who wants to put America back on the gold standard, which is particularly hilarious because the populists the gold standard was their nemesis, right? It's completely the opposite, what we call populism today. But the attacks and the insults with which the elite of 1896 met populism are exactly the same ones that are used against it today. In other words, it's a movement of people of the lower orders who have no business having any kind of say in government. It's an anti-intellectual movement. It's a kind of pathology. It's a social pathology. In fact, it's a form of mental illness right on down the line. And you can trace these things through the American, the backlash against populism in 1896. Now I'm going to wind this up. I don't mean to talk too much. I tend to really run on when I talk about these sort of wonderful chapters of American history. By the way, if you go to my website, tcfrank.com, I've got all the illustrations of this campaign against populism in 1896, and some of them are really blood-curdling. I mean, they're really alarming. Like one of them shows the presidential candidate of the populists as an immigrant with a big knife, and he's just assassinated Lady Liberty, and she lies bleeding on the steps of the U.S. Treasury. It's quite insane. But anyhow, this goes on to this day. And so the question that I asked in the book is, how did the meaning of the word flip? When did that happen, and how did it happen? And what I found, of course, I answered that question. It happened in the 1950s with a sort of new generation of intellectuals coming up in America, and they had joined the elite themselves, and they wanted to come up with a word to describe. Well, let me take a step back. They represented sort of managerial, profession, the sort of the rise of the professions into the places of power in American life. So people with MBAs were taking over the corporations, were running the corporations now instead of, millionaires or something like that. People with advanced degrees were running the government in Washington. People who understood political science, who had PhDs in political science, were running the Pentagon now. There's Robert McNamara, the Vietnam War, all that. And there was a generation of intellectuals coming up who were saying, yes, writing manifestos for their generation. They said, this is the end of ideology. We have figured the world out. We know how to deliver prosperity, through through managerialism in the professional class. We are going to, deliver this sort of wonder world. And they wanted a word to describe their foe, what they were displacing, the mass movements that had built the American left, the labor movement, the farmers movement, et cetera, et cetera. They wanted a word to describe the folly of that history that they were now overturning. And they settled on populism. And they built up a stereotype of this historical movement in the 1890s that was historically completely incorrect. And I mean, it was refuted very quickly within the American historical profession. It was, utterly lay in ruins within 5 years. But their sort of demonizing of populism as, using the same terms as in the 1890s, anti-intellectual, pathological, mentally ill, and then they added to that racist, that caught on. And that vision is now everywhere in the world. You see it all the time. It's in the New York Times every single day. I mean, I'm sure you hear it in Australia constantly. And okay, this is the last point I'm going to make, and then I'm shutting up. I promise. Okay. This is the crazy thing. There is although the word populism has changed its meaning completely, there is a total continuity from the anti-populists of 1896 to the anti-populists of today. They describe their foes, the sort of the lower orders, who need to stay in their place, this fear of democracy, this fear of mob rule, in exactly the same terms. It's absolutely uncanny. Anyhow, that's what the book's about.
And as I said, I'm only a few chapters in, but I can highly recommend it. It's an engrossing read so far. Wayne Swan, Thomas has talked about the history and the analogy with movements such as the Labor Party in Australia. Where's populism in Australia today?
Well, I think when it comes to the Labor Party, we're traditionally where we were in many ways in the 1890s. That is, we opposed what I'd call the tired, old, stale, trickle-down agenda that Thomas was talking about before, that came through in the 50s and has dominated so much of the policy and ideological debate since then. So the Labor Party is a party which is based on the trade unions and also membership broadly dispersed across the country that believes not only in the creation of wealth but the fair distribution of it. And in that sense, its origins are entirely similar to all of those organisations that Thomas was talking about back in the 1890s. I think we've got to a point where the word populist has been so debased it's almost meaningless, because what I think we need to be talking about is whether parties have got an inclusive agenda or whether they've got an elite agenda. And what we see through neoliberalism is an elite agenda. Tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation for the powerful, cutting holes in the social safety net, wage suppression and so on, which is the opposite of a populist agenda, but has been taken up by right-wing populists, if you like, and enshrined in the community on the back of the demonisation of government. So the big challenge that parties of the centre-left have is to highlight the use by so-called right-wing populists of an agenda which delivers to the few at the expense of the many.
Can I throw in there?
Yeah,
I was talking to one of my friends, Jim Hightower. He's one of the last guys in America who forthrightly calls himself a populist and embraces the term in the old-fashioned meaning of it. And he always says it's not about left and right, it's about top and bottom. It's about those that have and those that don't. And that is always the message. I was reading a book by an Australian author called Populism Now! ! And he pointed out a fact that I did not know, which is that when the Australian Labor Party was founded, they considered calling themselves the People's Party in homage to, that was the official name of the Populist Party in America. They considered calling themselves that because the Populist Party in America at the time looked pretty good.
Exactly. So the first Labor government in the world, Thomas, was in Queensland, my state, in the 1890s. In the 1890s. So there's a fine tradition here, as there is in other parts of the country and other Labor parties around the world, of populism, if you like.
Yeah.
Ben Oquist, can I ask you, why do you think Australians have such a fascination with American politics at the moment, and we're seeing this anti-populism sentiment come through so strongly in this political moment?
Well, great question, Ebony. Maybe I'll answer it with another question, which is partly because of the fascination, obviously, with Donald Trump, and that, I mean, maybe even more so to Australians and a majority of Americans, we just don't understand how seemingly such a corrupt, incompetent leader can do so well politically, and why Donald Trump won in the first place. And I guess my question to Thomas is, in a way, what is it about Donald Trump that is not populist? Because in some ways he represented the assault on, well, not the elites, but the establishment. He even took over the establishment of his own party. he was successful because elites had let down so much of the American population. And why isn't Donald Trump a populist? And I think that's part of the problem with the debate, is that he's been presented as a kind of antidote to the establishment by some, and he's given populism a bad name. So taking us all the way back from your writings from the 1890s, I wanted to throw us forward right to the present. And what does populism and its misuse tell us about Donald Trump?
It tells us that we are one hell of a confused society. And, and I share your sentiments exactly. So I was writing a book during 2015 when he was making his bid for the Republican leadership. And I finished the book and turned it in, and my kids, told me, Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. And I was like, what? The guy on TV, the asshole. Am I allowed to say that, by the way?
Yeah,
okay?
we can do a rating for it later.
Okay. This guy who says "you're fired." This is his famous catchphrase. That guy is going to be the Republican, and not only that, but then So on the why is he not a populist? Because, well, for one thing, he's a bigot, and the populists were the guys in the 1890s, and then sort of neo-populists in the 1930s were the people on the other side who fought who tried to bring races together, people from all different backgrounds together based on class interest. That's what their grand motivating idea was, and his is not that. And you also look at, of course, what he's done as president, which is what's his one great achievement is a huge tax cut for the very wealthy, and also he's deregulated massively, and here in the pandemic, he's done these incredible bailouts of big corporations. By the way, there was just a hearing today in America. Talk about a populist moment. There was a hearing of the four big leaders of, the CEOs of the big tech companies, which are these gigantic, people with fingers in every aspect of American life, and they behave like monopolies, and the populists would have known exactly what you do with these people. You break them up. You throw the weight of the law at them. Trump has done nothing against these people. By the way, neither did Obama, and neither did Bill Clinton before him, going back to Reagan. Now then, on the plus side is Trump's rhetoric. Let's be honest. The guy did try to talk, talk in a way that made blue collar workers and a certain kind of person feel like they were being listened to and they were being cared about in a way that the Democratic Party, which is the traditional party of labor in America, has long since stopped doing. And Trump is not the one that invented this. Remember, George W. Bush was very good at it, pretending to be a kind of man of the people. Ronald Reagan was excellent at it. Newt Gingrich even was good at it. And the man who invented it was Richard Nixon. There's been this whole series of very conservative politicians, each one more conservative than their predecessor, who have been very, very good at pretending to care about your values and pretending to care about middle Americans, but then, of course, advancing an agenda that's really different. There's I'm shutting up because you don't want to know the nuts and bolts of American politics, but there are so many fascinating aspects to this.
No,
so what
people do
want to
know
the nuts and bolts, I think. But so is it that Donald Trump harnessed populism but then abandoned it, or did he never had it?
I think so. There were some issues where Trump was genuinely to the left of Hillary Clinton. The main one being trade. The American labor unions have been up in arms about the different trade agreements signed in the Reagan era and how these agreements were designed to deindustrialize the United States, which is correct. And Trump caught on to that outrage and talked about it constantly. Would visit these factories where they were laying everybody off, et cetera. He did this all the time. Now, if you look beneath the surface, he had no idea what he was talking about. He had no idea. He knew that this was a winner. He knew that the audiences would applaud. They'd go crazy when he talked about it. But he didn't understand at all. And you get that sense about so many of the things he said. He among other things, he said he had opposed the Iraq War. Hey, that's great. He said, we need to stop these endless wars. I agree with that. That sounds good to me. He went after the Democrats for being too soft on Wall Street. Yeah, that's right. They were. And he did nothing on any of these things. He didn't mean a word of it. It was all just nonsense that he could see And what is fascinating about it, and this is all in addition to the outright bigotry, which he was also using, what is fascinating about that is that these are things that Republicans never would have dared to say in the past. They would hint at it. They would use certain phrases that sounded like they were going there. They love to pretend to be on the side of the, sons of toil. I had this great quote in the book from Ronald Reagan saying something like, I don't like to hang around with these executives. I like to be in the factories with the people who have calluses on their hands. Sure you do, Ronald Reagan, says the guy who, destroyed labor in the United States. But they say stuff like this all the time. You think of Richard Nixon talking about the silent majority and their values being trampled down by the cultural elites. And I guarantee you Trump is going to try it again this time with the culture wars, which are always this kind of fake populist thing about ordinary people with their humble ways being trashed by the despicable, publishers of the newspapers and masters of the, TV networks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's phony. It's fake. It sounds good to some people, but it's complete BS. They mean none of it. And they've been doing it for years and years and years. And all they want to do is cut taxes for their buddies.
Wayne, did you have anything that you want to add to that about what we're observing in the United States at the moment?
I wanted Thomas to tell me whether he thought there was some hope for optimism, given what the pandemic is actually doing now in communities, to the economy, and doing socially. Does Thomas think that this is going to demonstrate some of those very grave inequalities that have come through from the trickle-downers, such as the nature of insecure work, low pay, the inequality in the labour market, and the dual, if you like, representation that, in fact, it's those sort of workers who are just as essential in our economy as the high-paid executives. Does this demonstration give us hope for a political agenda as we go forward into the presidential election? And does it also, I think, demonstrate some of the dangers of a pretty rank corporate culture in the United States, where, you've got a race to the bottom when it comes to paying tax, you've got casualisation of the workforce, low-paid workers. Do those two trends, which have been opened up by the pandemic, provide a way in which the Democrats can move, if you like, further to the left and come through with a much more traditional progressive agenda?
I wish. Of course, it opens that window up. This is going to be shocking to an Australian audience, but in America, you only have health insurance if you're employed by, a certain kind of employer. You can, and of course there's, huge unemployment now as a result of this pandemic. And so people are losing their health care left and right. Now you can buy it now on what are called these exchanges, which were set up during the Obama administration, but they've got all kinds of problems. A lot of the insurance policies it's a ridiculous system where all the reforms were set up so as to preserve the insurance industry in there. We want to both have universal care and have this extremely profitable insurance industry and pharmaceutical industry. And it's a royal botch. It's just a huge mess. And it's incredibly obvious in this pandemic what a disaster the system is. And yes, it would provide a great space for the Democrats to run to the left. Now, however, I have to throw in here, I'm very critical of the Democratic Party as well as the Republicans. And in this book, as well as in and this, Wayne, I talk about it all the time. The Democratic Party is when they look at people like, say, Bernie Sanders, who was proposing a kind of universal health care system in the United States, setting that up, they regard a figure like that with a kind of horror. And the party tends to come together, or the leadership of the party tends to come together to figure out ways to keep a guy like that out. And they did exactly that, and were able to keep him out. There, about 6 months ago, they were holding these debates among the Democratic candidates, and they know that Bernie Sanders, that universal health care is popular. They know that Bernie Sanders is popular, et cetera. And they were all trying to mimic his solutions. But then once, the things developed, Barack Obama made a few phone calls, and they all dropped out of the race in favor of Joe Biden, who then proceeded to beat Sanders. And now Biden has said, absolutely not. We're not going to have universal health care in America. We might, beef up the Obamacare system, but no, we're not going to have what you guys have in Australia. And they just yesterday, I believe, codified that into their platform, to their platform for this election year. Bottom line is, if they had to say that to beat Donald Trump, they'd say it. I don't know whether they deliver, but they don't think they need that to beat Trump. Trump has proven himself such a bungler and look, you've got like 15% unemployment here. Nobody really knows. There's a mass die-off of small businesses. People are so angry in America right now. Trump is almost certainly going down. And so they don't have to deliver. One of the great things about populism is that the two-party system needs to be shaken up every now and then. You got to have some outsiders come in and just, expose the folly of the whole thing. And in America, we've after populism happened, we cracked down on that. We made that basically impossible. So it would never happen again. They took all these measures all over America and the States to make sure that this would never happen again. And we could really use something like that right now.
Ben, did you have another question for Thomas before we go to
it was just something we were Wayne and Thomas were talking about off air just before we came on air, was the differences, though, between Biden and Clinton, and whether there was something more in Biden that would enable him, one, to win, and two, to harness that, that he has harnessed that populism, and he doesn't come with the same in the past, and he doesn't come with the same baggage as Hillary Clinton that potentially is a glimmer of hope.
Yes, I wrote an article for The Guardian about this. I'm not a big fan of Joe Biden. I didn't vote for him in the primaries, and he's got a lot to answer for, if you ask me, over his long career as a senator from Delaware. On the other hand, Biden occasionally has these moments where he says things that are really perceptive and really wise about working people and the frustrations that they face in their lives. They used to call himself middle class Joe, and he was sort of proud of the fact that he was the least wealthy member of the United States Senate, and he would ride home. He didn't live in D.C. He would ride home every week on the train back to his hometown. And I was reading I don't know if you guys care. Oh, yeah, you do care. So I'll tell you the story. So he got interviewed by the New York Times editorial board, right? They were interviewing all the different Democratic candidates. And it was a really long interview, and it was just filled with the usual political nonsense. Biden trying to take the credit for everything good and distance himself from everything bad. And then at the very end, he told this anecdote about the 2016 election, which was such a fiasco for the Democrats, where he said that the Democratic Party had, that some Clinton operatives had told him that he had to, when he was out giving speeches on her behalf, he had to distinguish between progressive values and working class values. And Biden, took umbrage at this. And he starts sort of lacing into the New York Times editorial board saying, in fact, you smart people, you think you understand the world and you are the bearers of progressivism. But in fact, working class people, if you put the questions to them in the right way and speak to them in the right way, are actually much more progressive than you are. And he said this in I thought, a really awesome way. And so I think there is hope for Biden, and he certainly will never. Do you remember Hillary's great mistake in 2016? Was the deplorables remark. She referred to a big part of this country as the population of America as deplorables. people with horrible values, and everybody could Hillary has been tagged, I think, unfairly in my mind, but has been tagged as an elitist for decades by the American media. And everybody all of a sudden was like, oh my God, she's talking about me. She thinks I'm deplorable. And Biden will never make that mistake. That's one. And he also, he's just not a hated figure in the way that she was. And I think she was, don't get me wrong, she was hated unfairly. It was not fair that what happened to her. But Biden is by nowhere near as unpopular, and it's largely because of his sort of blue-collar sensibility.
Thanks. We might go to Q&A with the audience now. The first question I'm going to ask is from Alistair McCullough, who asks, if I am against populism, am I necessarily in favour of elitism? Thomas.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it depends, because the word has changed so much. I don't expect anybody to know about, the definition of that word in 1891 in Kansas. I don't expect any Australian to know that. I wrote this book to tell the world that story. And so, no, you're off the hook. You don't have to worry about me criticizing you or anything like that. However, that said, the sort of anti-populist theory that you see all over the place in political science departments and stuff like that has a very elitist edge to it, because it's always about counterposing the ignorant masses versus the intelligent elites, the people with PhDs. The whole model, when anti-populism went from being a right-wing phenomenon to being a phenomenon of the center-left, the whole model was this sort of managerial idea of American democracy, where the way you got reform and the way you got prosperity was by having a whole bunch of different elites or lobbyists or whatever sitting around a mahogany table in Washington, D.C. and making the decisions. That's how good things happen. That was the model, and it's an elitist model. I mean, obviously. And those are the people who like to use the word populism to trash working class movements. I mean, to this day, that is the implied, philosophy when you do that, when people do that.
I was really struck by one quote at the beginning of the book where you kind of summed up the hysteria and anti-populism that kind of was ushered in after 2016, was that if the people have lost faith in the ones in charge, it can only be because something has gone wrong with the people themselves. Can you just explain that sentiment for us a little bit?
So there's a whole bunch of quotes at the start of the book. Some of these quotes are so crazy. People were hysterical in the year 2016, and they're hysterical to this day. But there's a whole series of outrageous quotations of American pundits and political scientists and think tankers basically denouncing the people and saying what we need in this country is a little more respect for the elites, and it's always, of course, that what the guy means is for people like myself, right? The author, right? Whoever is saying this, he always identifies with the elites and is demanding that, that people pay him more mind. And it brought me back to that great quote from Bertolt Brecht, if only we could dissolve the people and elect another. He's talking about East Germany back in the communist days, of course, but yeah.
Wayne, I wonder if I might ask you about where we find ourselves at the moment in Australia after the outcome of the 2016 election and the 2019 election, and your reflections on that in this context of populism.
Well, certainly, because we took a very progressive platform to the last election, and one that's certainly very progressive, particularly in US terms. Progressive in terms of the distribution of wealth and income, progressive in terms of industrial relations, social safety, you name it. And we suffered a very narrow electoral defeat. We suffered that electoral defeat amongst lower income people in outer suburban areas and in regional Australia. So there's a pretty significant debate about how Labor should respond to that. And as you know, we went through a committee of inquiry. And I don't think the problem with our offering at the last election was the progressivism of the agenda. Its shape was good. I think overall its content was pretty good. But I think it was pretty large. And I think this was one of the problems that emerged in the primaries in the United States recently. A number of candidates who had very progressive policies had 4 or 5 of them at once. And I think the problem in our election was that we had some very big progressive policies. When they were all joined together, they were made to look pretty scary by the right. And our policies were easily demonised in the establishment media. As a consequence, we had a very narrow election loss. So when you're a progressive party, whether you want to call us populist, whether you want to call us social democrat, you have to actually get a good balance between the progressive nature of your policies and your capacity to get elected. So there's always this balance between the program you take forward and the program that will win you the 50% plus one, so you can get into a position of taking of winning office. So I think we've been through those lessons, if you like, in the party, in the process of putting together, I think, a progressive agenda, but one which makes us electable. We don't end up in the position that we were after the last election. This pandemic, I think, changes a lot of that debate. I mean, it demonstrates the need for sound industrial relations policies, the likes of which we put forward at the last election. It demonstrates the case for a strong investment in health and education. And it particularly demonstrates why the inequality that you get out of the trickle-down agenda from the government doesn't work and is not in the national interest. So I'm optimistic about the future. I'm optimistic about the future of progressive politics, both here and in the United States, because this pandemic really demonstrates why a strong social democratic state is necessary.
Thanks, Wayne. Carmela Gallo, I'm going to come to you to ask your question live in just a second. But first, I think I've got a question here from Max Hooper that I think follows on from some of what Wayne was talking about there. Thomas, he asks, what have the modern parties of the left, and I think you're talking about the US context only here, have centralised decision-making power in a factional-based system and the concentration of decision-making in fewer hands, as union representation in particular has shrunk, and the vested interests and think tanks, of which obviously the Australia Institute is one, do tend to play a greater role. How's that phenomenon manifesting itself in the United States and in the Democratic Party?
It's in high gear, and it's been running for about 30 years. So the Democratic Party at some point and I trace this in the book, by the way, at some point in the 60s and 70s, it was a gradual transition, decided they didn't want to be the party of labor anymore. I mean, once upon a time, as you guys know, the American Democratic Party was very, very, very closely identified with organized labor. And they decided at this time in the 60s and 70s that no, union members were in fact reactionaries, and they were very open about this. And in the real, the right constituency, the constituency that's really inspiring is college kids, the young, this is the age of Aquarius, all that, and this transition took many years, but basically over the years, they became a party where the leading constituent group is the sort of professional class, and the Democratic Party acts as a very, very much in the class interests of highly educated people. They run the Democratic Party. They identify with the Democratic Party more and more and more. You can see that's who votes for the Democratic Party. It's people with, who've been to college, people with advanced degrees. And here's what the tragedy of all that is that, the incredible obvious blunder of all that is that it's left the Republicans open to reach out to these blue collar voters with these ridiculous culture war appeals and the sort of Trumpism. But the other thing is that the message of populism is that the way you get social democracy, or the way you get economic reform, the way you reform a capitalist system, is with mass movements of ordinary people. There is no other way to do it. If you put a bunch of professionals in charge, that's, they're not interested in that. They're interested in being, in their fellow elites, and they serve their fellow elites, they bail them out, et cetera, make sure they don't get prosecuted, all the stuff that happened in the last decade here in the United States. You have to have a mass movement of working people. And that is so far from the consciousness of the mainstream Democratic Party. I've actually talked to Democratic Party leaders about exactly this question: why they won't. The labor movement in America has shriveled and shrunk, and it's down to something like geez, what is it, like 6% of the private sector workforce? I mean, it's shameful. And the Democrats have let this happen. They've let their own, main constituent group die, basically. And this is a disaster, not just for their electoral chances, but for any kind of, notion of, of economic reform. I want to say one last thing, that right now, the message of populism is the importance of mass movements of ordinary people. And there's a great theorist of populism, of American-style populism, died a couple of years ago. And he said that when you're building a movement like the farmers' movements in the 1890s, or the labor movement in the 1930s, or the civil rights movement in the 1960s, he said that you have to put together a gigantic coalition of ordinary people. This is the only way to do it. And in order to do that, you have to practice what he called ideological patience. And I love this term, ideological patience. You have to remember you're working with people who didn't go to graduate school. You're working with people who don't know the lingo, who often have very traditional views about all sorts of subjects. You can't just be judgmental towards them. And here in America, the left is on a kind of doing the exact opposite of that. We are in a race to purge and to kick people out and to proclaim ourselves to be, more radical than everybody else. And it's like one of those reality TV shows where we all think everybody else is going to get canceled and we're going to be the last guy left on the island, and we're going to have the whole damn thing to ourselves. We're going to be the left, the purest one of us all is going to kick everybody else out. And that is a recipe for disaster in so many ways.
I agree with that. I agree very much with that, Thomas. And one of the interesting trends that we're seeing at the moment in response to the pandemic is a renewed growth in union membership as people in the workforce discover how much more vulnerable they could be in this sort of crisis moment. So now is a very good opportunity for parties of the centre-left to be much more active at the grassroots level, to be much more active in recruitment and to broaden the base as much as possible. Because there is a tendency, as Thomas said, in all political parties for purists to think that everyone has to be exactly on the same page on every single issue, and that's not the case. What you have to do is you have to build a coalition across the board if you're going to take on the power of big capital. I mean, we've got to a point in our economic life where income and wealth is incredibly concentrated at the top. They use it viciously during elections, as they did in our last election with the deployment of tens of millions of dollars by Clive Palmer. That can only be beaten by people power and only be beaten by a coalition of groups on the centre and the centre-left. And
I have a funny anecdote for you, if you want to hear it.
Please.
Yep.
So the original anti-populist hysteria of 1896 was this fascinating moment in American life where what actually happened, it's a little more complicated than I told you at first. The Democratic Party had nominated a guy who opposed the gold standard. His name was William Jennings Bryan. He was a fantastic orator. And the populists saw this and said, well, this is our chance. And so they also nominated him. They said, we're going to get together and beat the Republicans in this way. And the sort of ruling class of America went absolutely berserk and started, the sort of hysteria that I told you about at the beginning. And one of the funny little episodes in this, the Republican candidate for president was a guy called William McKinley. He was kind of a cipher, but his right-hand man was a tycoon from Cleveland, Ohio. His name was Mark Hanna. And Mark Hanna was a genius at this game that you're talking about, Wayne. And he actually at one, he raised, by some measurements, the most money that has ever been spent in a presidential campaign in American history, even more if you define it in a certain way than they raise and spend today. And he outspent Bryan 20 to 30 to 1. We don't really know because there were no requirements they didn't have to tell you how much they raised and spent. But at one point during the campaign, he went door to door in Manhattan to the headquarters of the Fortune 500. This is the Republican campaign manager. And he says, open the books. He goes into their headquarters, says to the CEO, open the books. The guy does. He says, you made X number of dollars last year. We're taking, such and such percent of it for the Republican campaign for president because the class war is on. And if this guy Brian gets in, it's going to be, it's going to be like the French Revolution down there in Wall Street, and they did it. They paid the money. And Brian here, he didn't have a campaign. I mean, it was just him. He was going around the country in what they used to call a day coach, which just means, a passenger car. And he would sleep in the train stations. He had to carry his own suitcases. And then he would get off somewhere and give a speech. He was young and strong, so he could pull it off, but he had nothing. And they just wailed on him in the most, well, you see the sort of the residue of it on my website. The funniest stuff. I mean, it would be funny if it wasn't so horrible what they did to him, but they crushed this guy
with money.
Yep.
Carmela Gallo, do I have you on the line there? Do you have a question for the panel?
I think I may have accidentally put the hand up.
That's all right.
I don't have a question. Sorry.
No worries. I'm really sorry to put you on the spot then, Carmela. All right. The next question then, I think, takes on power in a different way, although it is linked, obviously, to big capital. But Mark Merritt asks, it's all well and good to talk about political players and try and understand their motivations, but what role does the media and media owners, the banks and industrialists play, and how do they fit into all of this? Thomas, what would you like?
Here in America?
Yeah.
So we're in this very interesting time in America where the newspaper industry is falling to pieces. So I'm here in Kansas City. Here's our newspaper, the Kansas City Star. When I was a kid, this was one of the great newspapers of America. I mean, one of the greats. Today, it's about 7 or 8 pages, mostly wire service copy. And I don't mean to give them a hard time about it. And it just got bought by a hedge fund 2 days ago. It had a big story, and it just got bought by a hedge fund, right? Owning a newspaper. And this is happening everywhere. I'm not singling them out for criticism. They do their best. I mean, there's something like 12 reporters now working. This is a city of 2 million people, Kansas City. There's 12 reporters. This is an incredible disaster, and it's happening everywhere. And the only exception are the 3 big newspapers in this country: the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And if you leave the Wall Street Journal, my former employer, if you leave them out, the other 2 are in this little media ecosystem where everybody knows everybody else. Everybody comes from the exact same background, always these Ivy League colleges here in America. They have the exact same views about the world. So in the surviving, the media that's going to make it, it's just this tiny little world where everyone is in agreement with everyone else. And it's incredibly dysfunctional. By the way, to publish my stories now, I have to go to British and French newspapers because the media market in America is such a mess. But I don't want to complain about it too much because then you have at the same time this invention of Rupert Murdoch, this genius thing called Fox News, which has captured the minds of this certain segment of the American population and, does this kind of fake populism backlash thing that I've been talking about, this culture war thing where it's like, oh my God, middle America, look at the crazy stuff that's going on out there in your streets. Look at the nutty things that people are saying. Can you believe how your tiny little world has fallen apart? And you're sort of elderly white people in America look at this and they're like, oh my God, we got to have law and order. And this is a well-known phenomenon in America. It has captured the minds of, and I've seen it to happen to family members of mine. One day they're normal people, with normal and their feet on the ground, and then the next day they've fallen for this kind of hysteria. It happens.
Well, Thomas, it's worse in Australia than it is in the United States. There's more pluralism in the media in the United States than there is in Australia. And
is that right? Is that right?
I don't think there's ever been a time where the conventional and established media have been more in the pocket of a government in this country than which is one of the very big challenges that progressive movements face. The good news is that parts of that media become more irrelevant by the day, and the technology is available to us if we can get the resources to go around them via social media. But there's a very, very big problem for the Labor Party and progressive parties in Australia when it comes to the media environment that we are in. It's a very challenging one, which is why the points we made before about mass movements, recruiting more members, getting more people involved, building coalitions is more important than ever.
Ben Oquist, I wonder if you might want to reflect on where the Australian media is currently and how that plays into populism, like Wayne was talking about.
Well, we've got in some ways, a much more concentrated and at the same time more diverse media. Of course, its business model is struggling, and public broadcasting in Australia is under pressure from a government that has been cutting it. It does present opportunities if people can get organised, more philanthropic support, pressure the government not to cut the ABC. But the current business models for media mean that traditional models are struggling. And then on the other hand, Australia's always had a fairly concentrated media market, much more owned by News Limited than in other countries. So I think how in a democracy, with a kind of collapsing public square and a shared public square, is a real big challenge for mass movements that build coalitions. When you've got a media market that's kind of segmenting under these pressures and people are tuning into just their own channels, and there isn't a kind of as much of a shared media anymore, building these mass movements that, as Thomas said, inevitably involve compromise and not agreeing on everything all the time straight away. I think that makes it a much tougher environment. One of the things we strive at the Australia Institute to do is to be pragmatic and not think you have to agree with everybody all the time. But I think our current media models that are segmenting and meaning people are tuning into just their channel make that even harder. And I think it's, yes, mass mobilisation and mass populism is essential for progressive change, but I think the dynamics at play now make that harder. All political parties have hollowed out in that kind of loss of trust in politics and trust in government. Having said that, we are at an unprecedented time when people have tuned in more to governments as a potential solution, both in the health crisis and the economic crisis. And of course, many governments have failed in that, and that can turn people off government and politics even more. But there is a potential to tune into that new belief in government, politics, the role of the state in solving an economic and health crisis that can be built upon if done cleverly. But one of the things I thought that I'd like to throw to Thomas is what is the role of the expert within populism? Because we're hearing a lot about the importance of listening to experts at the moment, whether on climate change or in the health response, listening to health experts about how to handle the pandemic. It kind of has links back to how to listen to climate experts in dealing with climate change. And what's the tension there between kind of elitism and listening to policy experts? What role do they have in a populist democracy, if you like?
Well, so none of the populist movements that I studied, like the labor movement in the 30s and the farmers movement in the 1890s, they weren't hostile to experts. What they tended to be rising up against economic orthodoxy. That's, so the experts hated them, right? The economists of the day back in the 1890s absolutely despised the populists. The jokes on them, though, because it turned out that the populists were the ones who were in the right. They wanted to get off the gold standard, and the experts of the day were like, "That is crazy. God gave us the gold standard. You can't take that away." And so the doubters, the scoffers, and the cranks turned out to be the ones who were right. But the populists actually were great admirers of science and of learning, and they thought of themselves, they thought of their movement as a kind of university. They would bring all these farmers together out in in a pasture somewhere and bring in speakers from back east who would educate them about whatever the subject was, economics or what they called political science at the time. And they fancied themselves to be very supportive of science and really interested in science, but they had a different model for it. They said that in a mass democracy like ours, where everybody gets to vote, and that's the ideal in the United States, that you have to, science has to serve the people. Science doesn't get to dictate to the people. Science has to be explained to them, and it has to serve us. And this is actually a recurring theme. This is not in the book, but it's in an article that I just published in a French newspaper called Le Monde Diplomatique. There's this long history of tension in America between sort of neo-populists calling for universal healthcare or other sort of ways of setting up healthcare, guaranteed healthcare for working class people. And then this pushback that always comes from organized science, in this case from the American Medical Association, which is the professional association of doctors. There's a famous story from Canada, which has its own sort of populist history, where a neo-populist party introduced Canadian healthcare, the single-payer model, in Saskatchewan in 1962. And the doctors were like, how dare you? We're going on strike. And they actually walked off. The doctors walked off the job. It's the most incredible thing. And within 5 years, I mean, the public sided with with the reformers in an overwhelming way. And within 5 years, every province in Canada had single payer healthcare. And so there's always this balancing thing. It's not that they want, quack medicine. They want the real deal. They just want it to be affordable. They want medicine and science to serve the people. And the problem is in America, I'm still trying to puzzle this out, like everyone in America. The problem is when you order people to get in line and to do what the experts say. What would an Australian do? An American would be like, hell no. You can't tell me what to do. That's just how Americans instinctively react. And so it's kind of a problem. But one other thing I want to say about this, and then I promise I'll shut up. You've got this, remember the stories that you were quoting from Ebony, where you had all these pundits saying, you have to listen to experts and the experts are right. And we've got this terrible problem in America where the people don't believe in the experts anymore. What all of those stories leave out, and you probably have noticed this in Australia, is this problem of elite failure. And we've had elite failure after elite failure in this country, going back to the Vietnam War, which was, remember, dreamed up by a bunch of political scientists. A bunch of guys from Harvard figured that sweet baby out. And it was a catastrophe, as was the Iraq War, as was the financial crisis, as were the bailouts of the Wall Street banks, on and on. The opioid epidemic, which was effectively engineered by, medical professionals. There's been, and not to mention the Hillary Clinton campaign, this debacle, which was which happened to the absolutely the best political minds in America were the ones that just walked right into that disaster, that couldn't beat the most unpopular presidential candidate of all time, meaning Donald Trump, this complete buffoon whose campaign manager had never managed a political campaign before. And the smartest guys in American politics couldn't beat him. It's like, every time they tell us that we have to respect elites and we need to shut up and do as we're told, I think of all of these examples. And it's just like, you got to take that into consideration, guys. Anyhow.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for your time today, Thomas Frank and Wayne Swan and Ben Oquist. And thank you everyone who's joined us today. We really appreciate you coming along. This has been a special episode of Follow the Money, and we're aiming to bring you shorter but more frequent episodes during the pandemic, so please stay tuned. For all the latest health information, you can visit health.gov.au or listen to the ABC's excellent Coronacast podcast, which comes out daily. To register for future webinars, including an upcoming one with the former Prime Minister of Australia, Julia Gillard, head to tai.org.au/webinars. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Thomas Frank is at Thomas Frank, all one word, _. Ben Oquist is at Ben Oquist, and Wayne Swan is at Swanee, Queensland. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macey, with help from Grace Crivellero and Lucy Law. And our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum. And remember, stay 1.5 meters away, wear a mask, keep washing those hands, and thanks for listening.